After years of working harder and sleeping less, he realized that the problem wasn't failure, it was chasing the wrong definition of success. That thought didn't arrive all at once. It came to him the way certain realizations do, without ceremony, without urgency. On a cold morning in late October, when the trees behind his house had already let go of most of what they were holding. Nathan Brooks stood at the kitchen sink, one hand resting on the edge of the counter, the other wrapped loosely around a chipped ceramic mug. The coffee inside had gone untouched long enough to cool. He noticed that only because the warmth was gone from his fingers. Outside, the field sloped gently toward the tree line. It wasn't his land originally. He'd bought it in pieces over the years. Quiet transactions, careful decisions, the kind that looked wise from the outside, the kind that made sense on paper. The grass was dull now, flattened in places where the deer crossed through at night. There was a stillness to the morning that didn't ask anything from him. That, more than anything, felt unfamiliar. For most of his adult life, mornings had been about movement, lists, timelines, calls that needed returning before someone else noticed the delay. He had learned to wake up already thinking, already measuring the day against what it was supposed to become. This morning didn't resist him, it simply existed. Nathan had been up since before dawn, out of habit more than need. The house was quiet in the way only older houses get. Settled, creaking softly, aware of their own age. His wife was still asleep upstairs. He hadn't wanted to wake her. There was nothing urgent to say. That realization lingered longer than he expected. Nothing urgent. He leaned forward slightly, resting more weight into the counter than necessary. His shoulders ached, not sharply, not enough to complain about, just enough to be noticed if he stopped moving. And lately, he had been stopping more often, not intentionally, not as a decision, just small pauses that kept happening before he could prevent them. He stared out the window again, following the fence line with his eyes. He remembered putting those posts in himself, one summer when the kids were younger. He'd worked late into the evening back then, coming inside with dirt under his nails and a sense of rightness that had nothing to do with numbers or progress. Back then, exhaustion felt honest. Now it felt negotiated. He took a slow sip of the coffee, grimaced at the bitterness, and didn't bother fixing it. Perfection no longer seemed worth the effort it demanded. There was a time when he would have already been reviewing the day in his head, jobs scheduled, invoices pending, what expansion might look like next year if things continued on their current trajectory. The word trajectory used to give him comfort. It implied direction, momentum, proof. This morning, it landed flat. He set the mug down and stood there longer than necessary, aware, dimly, without accusation, that something inside him had been tightening for years without his consent. Not pain, not regret, something quieter, a resistance that had learned how to stay polite. By mid-morning, Nathan was driving the long way into town. It wasn't a shortcut, it wasn't efficient. It added nearly 15 minutes, which, by his old standards, would have felt irresponsible. But lately, he had begun to notice how often efficiency demanded something from him without offering much back. The road curved gently along the river, the water dark and slow beneath a thin layer of mist. The trees stood farther apart here, their branches bare now, revealing the shape they carried all year, but rarely showed. Nathan kept the radio off. He used to fill silence instinctively. News, market updates, voices talking about things that sounded important enough to justify the noise. Somewhere along the way, that habit had loosened its grip. At a red light near the old feed store, he caught his reflection in the windshield, faint, distorted by glare. He looked older than he felt, or maybe he felt older than he had been willing to admit. 48 hadn't arrived with drama. No crisis, no collapse, just a slow accumulation. Responsibility layered over responsibility until even success felt like something he had to carry carefully. afraid of dropping it and disappointing someone who wasn't watching as closely as he imagined. He pulled into the gravel lot beside one of the properties he still personally checked on, though he could have sent someone else. A farmhouse that had been empty since spring. White siding, weathered but solid. The kind of place that endured neglect better than constant improvement. Nathan shut off the engine and stayed seated, hands resting on the steering wheel longer than necessary. He thought about the early years of the business, how he had told himself he would only push this hard for a little while, just until things stabilized, just until the kids were older, just until the numbers proved he was doing it right. Stability had come, so had proof. What hadn't arrived was the sense of arrival he had been promised, quietly, implicitly, by everyone who admired his discipline. He stepped out of the truck, the cold biting sharper than he expected. The air smelled like damp leaves and soil. Honest, unimpressed. He walked the perimeter of the house slowly, boots crunching over gravel and frost-thinned grass. One gutter needed clearing, a shutter hung loose on the backside. Nothing urgent, nothing that justified the tension that still lived in his chest. Standing there, he felt something surface, not frustration, not anger, but a question he hadn't given himself permission to ask. What if the way he had been living wasn't wrong, just no longer true? The thought startled him. He had built his life on consistency, on staying the course, on not questioning things that were working. But lately, working had begun to feel like a narrow definition. He finished his check, scribbled a note on the clipboard, and leaned against the truck for a moment before getting back in. His breath fogged in front of him, visible proof of something leaving his body. He didn't rush to wipe it away. For the first time in a long while, Nathan allowed himself to stay with a thought instead of solving it. The road ahead didn't feel unclear. It felt over-explained, and that, quietly, unsettled him more than uncertainty ever had. He met his crew just before noon. They were already unloading tools when Nathan pulled up. Easy movements, familiar rhythm. Men who knew what they were doing without needing direction every minute. He noticed that with a kind of distant gratitude. One day, he had been proud of how little they needed him. Lately, that pride had softened into something else. "Morning, boss," one of them said, nodding as he passed. Nathan returned the nod. He listened more than he spoke as they reviewed the work for the day. Roof repair, nothing complicated, the kind of job that rewarded patience more than speed. As they got started, Nathan found himself standing back, hands in his pockets, watching for a moment longer than usual. He could step in, he always could. He still knew how, but he didn't. It wasn't laziness, it wasn't detachment. It felt more like restraint. He walked toward the edge of the property, where an old stone wall marked the boundary between maintained land and woods that had long since decided to take care of themselves. He remembered clearing brush here years ago, sweating through his shirt, convinced that visible effort equaled progress. He had been younger then, not just in age, in certainty. A phone buzzed in his pocket. He looked at it, an email notification, probably about scheduling, or billing, or a decision that needed his approval. He left the phone where it was. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise ever had, not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. He sat on the stone wall and let his shoulders drop. The cold seeped through his jeans, grounding him in the moment. He watched the crew work, their voices rising and falling, the sound of hammer against wood steady and unremarkable. This, he realized, was what he had been building toward all along. Competence, continuity, trust. And yet, standing here now, he felt an ache that had nothing to do with wanting more. It had to do with wanting different. Success, he was beginning to see, had quietly rewritten the terms of his life. It had asked him to be available always, to measure himself constantly, to remain hungry long after hunger had stopped being honest. He had agreed without noticing. A memory surfaced, his son years ago, asking if he'd be home for dinner. Nathan had said yes, meaning it. Then no, later, apologizing with reasons that made sense, but still missed something important. He hadn't failed that night. But something small had shifted. The stone wall was cold against his palms. He pressed down slightly, feeling its steadiness. It had been there long before his business. It would remain long after. Some things didn't respond to pressure. The thought came unannounced, settled gently and stayed. He stood slowly, brushed his hands, and finally checked the phone. Nothing urgent, nothing that couldn't wait an hour. He slipped it back into his pocket without replying. For the first time in years, Nathan felt the subtle relief of not chasing the moment he was already standing in. That evening, Nathan arrived home earlier than he usually did. Not early enough to be noticed as a gesture, just early enough to feel slightly out of place. The truck tires crunched softly along the gravel drive as he pulled in. The house sat the way it always had, unassuming, practical, familiar. The porch light wasn't on yet. Dusk hovered in that undecided space between afternoon and night. He sat in the truck for a moment before getting out. This pause wasn't new. He had been doing this more often, sitting still after arriving somewhere, as if his body needed a few extra seconds to catch up with where it already was. Inside, the house smelled faintly of something baking. Apples, maybe. Cinnamon, his wife's doing. She had a way of making the house feel occupied, even when no one was speaking. "Hey," she said from the kitchen when she heard the door. "Hey," he replied. Their exchange didn't carry weight or urgency. It didn't need to. Years together had softened their need for constant explanation. She glanced at the clock, registered the time, then looked at him, not surprised, just curious. "You're home early." He nodded. "Work wrapped up." That was true enough. He washed his hands at the sink, the warm water loosening something in his fingers. He noticed how quiet his mind felt, how the usual mental inventory of unfinished tasks failed to assemble itself. Dinner was simple. They ate without rushing. Talk drifted toward ordinary things: weather, a neighbor's fence repair, their daughter's upcoming plans. Nathan listened more than he spoke, not because he was withdrawn, but because listening suddenly felt sufficient. Afterward, he stepped outside alone. The air had cooled further. Stars were beginning to show, tentative at first, then steadier. He leaned against the porch railing, hands resting where they always had. He thought about the years when success felt like forward motion no matter the cost, when rest felt earned only after exhaustion, when slowing down seemed suspicious, almost irresponsible. No one had ever told him to live that way. He had simply absorbed it. Standing there now, he felt a quiet recognition settle in, not as regret, not as guilt, but as something gentler. He had mistaken momentum for meaning. The realization didn't ask him to dismantle his life. It didn't demand change by morning. It simply offered him a truer measure of what he had already been given. Behind him, the house glowed warmly through the windows. Inside were people who knew him beyond performance. Outside, the land held its quiet patience. Nathan breathed in deeply, then out. Clarity he was learning didn't always arrive as an answer. Sometimes it arrived as permission to stop proving, to stop pushing, to let what mattered speak without being chased. He stayed there until the cold reached his bones, then went back inside, carrying with him a calm he didn't need to explain. The next morning arrived without announcement. No revelation, no renewed sense of drive. Just light pressing gently through the curtains and the sound of the house waking the way it always had. Pipes shifting, a floorboard answering his step. Nathan sat at the edge of the bed longer than usual, elbows resting on his knees, hands loosely folded. He wasn't tired in the way sleep fixes. He recognized that now. Downstairs, he brewed coffee and stood by the window again. The field looked unchanged. That steadiness mattered more to him than it once had. He thought about the years he had measured himself by output, by growth, by how little margin he left between effort and exhaustion. It had all felt necessary at the time, noble even, and maybe it had been, but seasons changed without asking permission. After breakfast, he reviewed the day's schedule. He didn't cancel anything. He didn't make a declaration. He simply adjusted one meeting, pushed it back, left space where there hadn't been any before. The space felt strange. He drove to town, parked, walked into the hardware store he'd been visiting for decades. The bell above the door rang, a small, familiar sound. The owner greeted him by name. They talked briefly about nothing that mattered much. Nathan noticed how grounding that felt. On his way out, he paused beside a rack of gloves, worn leather, practical, meant to protect hands that still intended to work, but not endlessly. He bought a pair without overthinking it. Outside, the air was sharp again. He stood there, bag in hand, watching people pass. Everyone seemed to be moving somewhere specific, purposeful, necessary. He had lived like that for a long time. Now, standing still, he felt something settle rather than surge. Success, he realized, hadn't ruined him. It had simply grown louder than everything else. And in the quiet spaces between jobs, between expectations, between one season and the next, he was finally beginning to hear what had been waiting patiently all along. He got back into the truck and drove on, not chasing the day, not resisting it either, just present. There was no single moment when Nathan decided anything had changed. That was the part that surprised him later. He had always believed that important shifts announced themselves through decisions, through conversations, through firm conclusions spoken out loud. But this one moved differently. It settled rather than declared. Weeks passed. Work continued. The business didn't falter because he slowed his grip. If anything, it steadied. He delegated without hovering. He left job sites earlier when the work was done, instead of inventing reasons to stay. Some evenings, he still felt the old pull, the instinct to fill every hour, to justify the day by how much it extracted from him. When that happened, he noticed it without argument. Some things don't respond to pressure. The phrase returned quietly, like a truth that didn't need defending. One Sunday afternoon, he walked the back edge of the property again. Leaves had gathered in corners he hadn't bothered clearing. He let them be. The air was colder now, the ground firm beneath his boots. He stopped near the fence and rested his hands on the top rail. For a long time, he had believed that what mattered most was what he was building toward. The next goal, the next level. The proof that the sacrifice had been justified. Standing there, he understood something without needing to name it fully. What mattered had been present all along. It was in the steadiness of his work, when it no longer needed to impress. In the quiet meals that didn't require explanation. In the land that held its shape whether he pushed it or not. He felt no urge to go back inside right away. The light shifted. The day moved on. Nathan stayed, breathing slowly, letting the moment remain what it was. Complete without being productive, sufficient without being measured. He hadn't abandoned success. He had simply stopped asking it to tell him who he was. And in that release, something settled into place, not as triumph, not as clarity, but as peace, the kind that doesn't rush you forward, the kind that stays. That night, Nathan lay awake for a while after the house had gone quiet, not restless, just awake. The kind of wakefulness that isn't asking for sleep to come faster, only allowing the day to finish leaving the body. Beside him, his wife breathed evenly, familiar, steady, a sound he had learned to trust without listening too closely. He turned slightly, careful not to wake her, and stared at the faint outline of the ceiling. He thought about the younger version of himself, the man who believed that rest was a reward and meaning was something earned only after enough strain. He felt no embarrassment toward that man now, no regret. That man had done what he knew how to do, and this one, this quieter version, was learning something different. He realized that the resentment he'd been carrying wasn't really toward success itself. It was toward the way he had let it define the boundaries of his worth, toward how it had slowly crowded out stillness, presence, gratitude, without ever announcing its intentions. Success hadn't been cruel. It had simply been loud. In the days that followed, nothing dramatic happened. No announcement, no reinvention. He continued his work. He honored his responsibilities. He showed up, but he no longer confused effort with identity. Some afternoons, he left the truck parked and walked the land instead. Some mornings, he sat longer with his coffee. Some decisions took more time, not because he was uncertain, but because he was no longer rushing past himself. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the quiet inside him stopped feeling empty. It began to feel full, full of moments that didn't need to lead anywhere, full of days that didn't need to prove themselves, full of a life that didn't ask to be chased in order to be meaningful. Nathan understood now that not every season moves when pushed. Some seasons wait to be recognized. That understanding didn't make him lighter, it made him steadier. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. Winter came the way it always had. Slowly at first, then all at once. Snow settled into the corners of the fields and along the stone wall, filling spaces that had been empty without trying to improve them. Nathan watched it from the window one early morning, coffee warming his hands, the world outside reduced to shape and silence. There was less to do on days like this. That used to trouble him. Now, it felt like permission. He still worked, still planned, still carried responsibility with the same care he always had. But the work no longer followed him into every room of his life. It stayed where it belonged. Some evenings, he found himself sitting without a reason, not resting from something, just sitting with what was. He didn't talk about it, didn't label it. He knew better now than to turn quiet into a concept. What mattered didn't need defending. One afternoon, as the light faded early and the house grew still, Nathan stood by the window again and felt a familiar steadiness settle in his chest. Not pride, not accomplishment, alignment. The kind that comes when nothing is chasing you and you are no longer chasing anything back. He hadn't escaped his life. He had finally arrived inside it, and that, he understood, was not the end of striving. It was the end of confusion. The rest could wait. Somewhere in this story, you may have recognized a quiet part of yourself. Not the part that wants more, the part that's tired of proving. If that recognition stayed with you, don't rush past it. There are seasons when clarity doesn't arrive as a decision, but as a slowing. When what truly matters doesn't ask to be chased, it waits to be noticed. Many people never give themselves permission to notice it. If this moment felt familiar, you're not alone in it. The next story waiting on your screen carries a different setting, a different life, but the same question beneath it. Not about success, about timing, about what happens when responsibility has been carried well for a long time, and the soul begins to ask for alignment instead of applause. If you want to stay with stories that move at a human pace, that don't rush resolution, and that understand this season of life without explaining it, subscribe. Not for content. For continuity, the next reflection is already there. It's quieter than most things worth hearing.